The boxes were already stacked by the door when he said it. I was taping the last one shut, our wedding photos inside, wrapped in old newspaper, when Mark walked through from the kitchen with his coffee mug, barely glancing at me, and dropped it like it was nothing. "Oh, by the way, I moved our savings. Shifted it into a separate account. For safety." I didn't move. The tape gun was still in my hand. My fingers tightened around it slowly, like my body understood what my brain was still catching up to. For safety. 2 words. Casual. Breezy. The way you'd mention you'd picked up milk on the way home. He kept walking. Didn't stop. Didn't look back to see my face. I stood there in the half-empty living room surrounded by the physical evidence of a marriage coming apart, our things sorted and separated and taped into cardboard, and I felt something move through me that was hotter and steadier than anger. Not panic. Not tears. Something colder. Because what Mark didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he had never once in 11 years believed I was capable of moving faster than him, was that I had already moved. 3 weeks earlier. My name is Lauren Mitchell. And he had just made the last mistake he was ever going to make with my money. I set the tape gun down on the box very carefully. That was the most important thing I did in that moment. Not scream. Not follow him into the kitchen and demand an explanation. Not cry. I set it down carefully, took one slow breath, and stayed completely still. Because I had learned something important about Mark over 11 years of marriage, something it took me far too long to understand. He made his moves when he thought I was distracted, when he thought I was too emotional to think clearly, when he assumed I was so focused on holding things together that I wouldn't notice what was slipping through my fingers. He was a man who operated on assumptions. And his biggest assumption, the one that had always run quietly underneath everything else like a current, was that I needed him to make decisions. That without his direction, I would flounder. That I was the heart of this marriage and he was the brain. I had spent 11 years letting him believe that. Not out of weakness. Out of exhaustion. Out of the endless calculation a woman makes when she is married to a man who mistakes management for love. But 3 weeks ago, that calculation had changed. I heard his coffee mug hit the counter in the kitchen. Heard him turn on the television. I looked at the boxes. I almost smiled. Go ahead, I thought. Sit down. Relax. You think you just won something. I need to take you back. Not far, just far enough to explain who I was before I became who I am now. I was always the one who planned. In college, while Mark was charming professors and coasting on confidence, I worked 2 jobs, kept a color-coded budget spreadsheet, and graduated without debt. We met in our final year. He was magnetic. I mistook his certainty for strength. In the early years of our marriage, I handled everything that required patience. The insurance policies. The tax filings. The monthly budget reviews. The savings contributions. I built the financial structure of our life piece by piece, the way you build anything that's meant to last, carefully, without fanfare. Mark handled the things that had an audience. The dinner reservations. The vacation planning. The announcements at family gatherings about what we were doing next. It took me years to see the pattern clearly. He performed our life. I constructed it. And somewhere along the way, in the slow, grinding way that these things happen, the person who did all the invisible work became invisible herself. I stopped being Lauren, the woman he married. I became the background. The infrastructure. The thing you only notice when it stops working. That was fine. For a long time, I told myself that was fine. Until the morning I opened our joint bank account statement and saw the first withdrawal I hadn't made. That was 6 weeks ago. A Tuesday. I was at my desk at work, eating lunch at my keyboard the way I always did, and I had the bank app open out of habit. I checked it every few days, I always had. The withdrawal was for $4,000. Labeled simply, transfer. I put my sandwich down. I sat very still and stared at the screen. We had talked about separating. Not screaming arguments, we were past that by then. Quiet, tired conversations about how this wasn't working and hadn't been for a long time. We had agreed, in that careful way that people agree to things they don't fully accept yet, that we would need to divide things properly. What we had not agreed to was anyone moving money without telling the other. I checked the account history. There were 2 more transfers. Both from the previous month. Both labeled the same way. $11,000. Gone. I didn't call him. I didn't text. I opened a new browser tab. And I began to plan. Not out of spite. Not out of revenge. Out of the same clear-eyed, methodical thinking that had always been my greatest strength, the one he had always taken for granted. He wanted to move first. Fine. I would move smarter. The first call I made was not to a lawyer. It was to my bank. I asked to speak with someone about opening an individual account, not joint, not linked, completely separate, and I transferred there that afternoon on my lunch break. The branch was 3 blocks from my office. I had walked past it 100 times. I sat across from the advisor, a calm woman named Patricia, and I told her I was separating from my husband and needed to protect my financial position. She didn't blink. She pulled up a form. 30 minutes later I had a new checking account, a new savings account, and a new debit card that I activated immediately and tucked into the inner pocket of my work bag where Mark never looked. On the way back to the office I stopped at a coffee shop and sat for 10 minutes. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Capable. Not just competent. I had always been competent. Capable in the deeper sense. The sense that says, you can handle what is coming. You have already started handling it. That evening I came home and made dinner and asked Mark about his day and listened to him talk about a disagreement he'd had with someone at work. I nodded in the right places. Laughed at the right moments. He never once asked about my day. Some things never change. But I was changing. Quietly. Precisely. And I had only just begun. Over the next 2 weeks I moved carefully. The first thing I did was redirect my direct deposit. My salary had always gone into our joint account, a habit from early in the marriage when we were building together. I changed it to go directly into my new individual account instead. It took 4 minutes online. Mark didn't manage the day-to-day finances. He never had. So he wouldn't notice immediately. But I knew eventually he would check, the way he occasionally checked things when he remembered they existed, not out of interest, but out of the need to feel in control. I estimated I had 2 weeks before he noticed anything was different. I used those 2 weeks well. I contacted the investment platform where we held 2 index funds, both funded primarily by money I had earned and managed, and I began the process of separating my contributions. I had documentation going back years showing the source of every deposit. I had always kept records. Not because I suspected this day would come. Because I was the kind of person who kept records. Now those records were a shield. I also called Patricia at the bank again and asked about opening a money market account for short-term savings protection. She remembered me. You came prepared last time, she said. I always come prepared, I said. And then I went back to work and put in 3 extra hours on a proposal that had been sitting on my desk for a month, because I was also going to need a promotion. Mark called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in a meeting. I saw his name on my phone screen, face up on the table in front of me, and I let it ring. He called again 20 minutes later. I let that one ring too. By the time my meeting ended, there were 2 voicemails. I walked to the window at the end of the hallway, the one that looked out over the parking structure, and I listened to both of them. The first was casual. Almost convincing. Hey, just wanted to catch up. Give me a call when you can. The second was less casual. The edges of his voice had tightened slightly. Lauren. I've been trying to reach you. I think we should talk about the finances before things get complicated. Before things get complicated. I stood at the window for a moment and thought about that phrase. He was calling because he had checked something. Noticed something small. Maybe the direct deposit change had already flagged. Maybe he was just doing the periodic check-in that his ego required, the reassurance that everything was still where he had put it, still under his control. Either way, he was calling because something felt off. Good. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to my desk. I did not call him back that day. Or the next. Let him feel what off-balance felt like. I had felt it for years. He could manage a few days. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with the end of something you tried very hard to save. I don't want to skip past that. It would be dishonest to tell this story as if I was only ever calm and strategic and sure of myself, because that wasn't true. There were evenings that first month when the weight of it hit me in ways I hadn't expected. I drove past our old apartment one Tuesday night, the one we'd lived in the first 3 years of our marriage, before we bought the house. The lights were on in the window. Someone else lived there now. I sat in the car outside for longer than I should have. I thought about who we were in that apartment. Before the patterns hardened. Before I became infrastructure and he became performance. Before I stopped expecting to be seen and started expecting to be managed. I cried. Quietly, in the dark car, without drama. Not because I wanted to go back. I didn't. I knew with complete clarity that there was nothing to go back to, that what I was leaving was already gone, had been gone for a long time, and that I had just been the last to stop pretending otherwise. I cried because I had given 11 years to something that turned out not to be what I thought it was. That deserves a moment of grief. I gave it that moment. Then I started the car and drove to my new apartment. And I kept building. My financial advisor's name was Conrad Bell. My friend Angela had recommended him 3 years earlier for something unrelated, and I had put his card in my wallet and never called. The card was still there, slightly soft at the corners but readable, when I pulled it out and dialed his number. He had an office in a quiet building near the river. I went on a Saturday morning. I sat across from him and laid out everything. The joint accounts, the individual accounts I had opened, the investment funds, the documentation I had compiled, the transfers Mark had made, and what I needed to protect. Conrad took notes without reacting. He had the calm of someone who had heard many versions of this story before. "You've done more of the groundwork than most people do," he said when I finished. "I've always done the groundwork," I said. That was the problem. He outlined a strategy. Structured transfers into protected accounts. An investment plan built around my salary and timeline. Documentation of what was individually sourced versus jointly held. For the first time in months, I felt the shape of my future becoming clear. Not scary. Not uncertain. Defined. I drove home afterward and sat on my new balcony with a cup of tea and my notebook open, writing down the next steps. The list was long. I didn't mind. Long lists were where I thrived. 5 weeks after Mark's voicemail, my credit score came back. I checked it through the app Conrad had recommended, a clean dashboard, all my accounts listed clearly, nothing joint, nothing tangled, and saw the number. It had gone up by 41 points. I stared at it for a full minute. 41 points. In 5 weeks. Because the debt-to-available credit ratio had changed. Because I was no longer carrying the invisible weight of his spending patterns in the background of my financial profile. I thought about all the years I had believed that our financial health was our financial health. Shared. Collective. Assumed. What I had never clearly seen was that his habits were dragging the shared number down. That my discipline had been propping up a profile that reflected both of us, but the burden of discipline had only ever been mine. Standing alone, my number was 41 points higher. That felt like more than a number. It felt like evidence. Mark called again that week. I let him leave a voicemail. This one was sharper. He had discovered the direct deposit change. His voice had a tight, controlled quality, the one he used when he was angry but trying not to sound angry. "Lauren, this needs to stop. We need to have a real conversation." I listened to it twice. Then I opened Conrad's investment portal and moved the next planned transfer. Angela noticed before anyone else did. We had coffee on a Sunday morning, a habit we had maintained through 15 years of friendship, through jobs and moves and marriages and everything else life had stacked between us. She looked at me across the table and said, "Something is different with you." "Different how?" I asked. "You seem settled," she said. "Like you stopped waiting for something." I thought about that. She was right, but not in the way she might have meant. I hadn't stopped waiting. I had stopped needing to wait. There is a difference, the difference between someone who has given up and someone who has already handled the thing they were waiting to face. I told her the broad outline. Not every detail, I was still being careful, but enough. The accounts. The plan. The fact that I was 3 months ahead of where Mark assumed I was. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always knew you were the one holding everything together. I just didn't know you were going to be this calm about taking it back." "Calm is the strategy," I said. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I hadn't realized how much I needed that. Just someone who knew, who saw it clearly, who confirmed I wasn't imagining the shape of what had happened. It helped more than I can explain. Mark made his first public mistake at his sister Pauline's birthday dinner. I had agreed to attend. We were still technically in the same household at that point, still moving through the formalities of separation without having made anything official, and I sat at the far end of the table while his family gathered around the way they always had. He had a glass of wine in hand, and that particular expansiveness that came over him in social settings, the performance, the volume turned up, the need to be seen as the one who had things handled. "Had to make some tough calls lately," he said, to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. Financial stuff. Made sure everything was protected. Sometimes you have to be the one to make the hard decisions. His brother nodded. His mother smiled. I kept my face completely neutral and took a small sip of water. He was telling a story about himself as a protector. A man who had been bold and decisive in a difficult situation. The audience, family, friends, people who had known us for years, received it warmly. What they didn't know was that the money he was describing protecting was already partially gone from the accounts he thought he controlled. That the woman sitting quietly at the end of the table had been 3 steps ahead of this story for weeks. I smiled faintly at his mother when she caught my eye. She smiled back. Neither of us said a word. I started keeping a detailed record of his spending patterns. Not out of any feeling of bitterness. Purely as documentation. Conrad had advised me early on that in any legal separation process, financial behavior in the months preceding and following the decision to separate could become relevant. Patterns mattered. Context mattered. What I found confirmed everything I had already known. In the 6 weeks since he had announced he'd moved our savings for safety, Mark had spent nearly $3,000 on things that had nothing to do with safety. Dinners at restaurants I had never been taken to. A weekend trip I had not been told about until after. New equipment for a hobby he had picked up and would likely abandon within a year. Meanwhile, the savings account he had moved money into, the one he thought was sealed and protected from me, I had already identified through cross-referencing our joint statements. Conrad was monitoring it. He was spending confidently. Recklessly. The way people spend when they believe they have more than they do. What he didn't understand yet was that the financial ground he was standing on had been shifting beneath his feet for weeks. He thought he had built a wall. What he had actually done was build himself into a corner. There is a difference. He would learn it soon. I sent him a text on a Thursday. Short. Friendly in tone. "Hey, the water bill came in. Can you check that the utilities account still has enough to cover it? I want to make sure nothing lapses during the transition." It was completely ordinary. The kind of message I had sent 100 times over 11 years. He responded within 4 minutes. "Already handled. Don't worry about it." I set my phone down and smiled. "Don't worry about it." The response of a man who needed to believe he was still managing things. Who heard the text not as a logistical question but as an opportunity to reassure himself that he was still in charge of something. He had taken the bait exactly as I expected. Because here is what Mark had never understood about me, what he had never needed to understand, because understanding me wasn't something he had ever prioritized. I didn't send messages without purpose. Every communication in these weeks had been deliberate. Designed to give him a specific impression of where I was. The impression I was giving him was that I was managing, coping, asking occasional practical questions, getting through. The impression was false. I was not getting through anything. I was already through. And the distance between where he thought I was and where I actually was grew wider every single day. People noticed the tension. Our mutual friends, couples we had known for years, people who had been at our wedding, who had seen us through the ordinary progress of a shared life, began to sense that something was off. The invitations to joint dinners became slightly more cautious. The group messages took on a careful quality. 3 of them reached out to me separately over the course of 2 weeks. 2 of them gently suggested that maybe I was being a little hasty. That separation was a big decision. That Mark seemed genuinely stressed about things and perhaps we could work it out. I listened to all of it without arguing. I appreciate you saying that, I told each of them. I've thought about it carefully. That was all. I didn't explain my position. I didn't defend myself. I didn't outline the financial record I had built or the accounts I had established or the strategy one had been executing for nearly 2 months. I had nothing to prove to anyone's timeline but my own. What I noticed, and this was interesting, genuinely interesting, was that none of their concern seemed to extend to asking how I was doing. Whether I was okay. What I needed. Their concern was for the marriage. For the institution. For the idea that things should be worked out. Not for me. I filed that observation away and kept moving. I moved into my new apartment on a Saturday in early spring. It was smaller than the house. 1 bedroom, a living space, a kitchen with a window that faced east and caught the morning light. I had rented it 6 weeks earlier, paying the deposit from my individual account, and had been quietly moving things there in the evenings. Boxes of books, kitchen items that were mine, the things that had been mine before the marriage and would be mine after it. The last thing I moved was a small framed print that had hung in every place I'd lived since I was 22. A simple thing, just a line drawing of a coastline, bought from a street market for $12. Mark had always hated it. Too plain, he said. Too simple. I hung it on the wall above my new desk. Stood back and looked at it. The apartment was quiet. Fully mine. No performance required, no management to absorb, no invisible work to do for anyone but myself. I made tea. Sat on the small balcony with my notebook. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary Saturday way. People walking dogs. A couple arguing quietly at a bus stop. A child on a bicycle with training wheels, wobbling determinedly down the path. I breathed. This was not an ending that felt like loss. This was an ending that felt like the beginning of something I should have started years ago. The voicemails changed tone around week 7. They became more frequent first. 3 in a single week, then 4. Then the content shifted. Less casual. Less performed. The confident edge in his voice had developed a crack in it, like something solid showing stress. Lauren, I need to understand what's happening with the finances. I've noticed some changes and I think we need to sit down and talk properly. Then, 2 days later, I've been trying to reach you for 2 weeks. This isn't fair. We agreed to handle this maturely. Then, I spoke to a lawyer. You need to call me back. I listened to each one carefully. Not to feel anything about them. I had moved past the stage where his voice triggered much in me either way, but to gauge where he was in his understanding of the situation. He had spoken to a lawyer. That was expected. The lawyer would have asked him to document his assets. He would have started that process and discovered, in the course of it, that things were not where he thought they were. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. Not yet. But differently. Shifted. Rearranged in ways he couldn't fully map. He was starting to feel what I had felt for years. That sensation of reaching for something you were sure was there and finding the space where it used to be. I understood that feeling. I had lived in it. I set the phone down and called Conrad to schedule our next review. The investment came through on a Tuesday. Conrad had been building toward it for 6 weeks, a medium-term fund under my name alone, built from my salary contributions and the documented individual assets I had separated from our joint holdings. It was the largest single financial move I had made in my own name since before the marriage. The bank confirmation came through the app at 11:47 a.m. I was sitting at my office desk. I read it once. Then again. Then I got up very quietly, walked to the small kitchen area at the end of the hallway, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window for a moment. I had done this. Alone. Without asking permission, without explaining myself, without softening the edges of my own decision to make someone else more comfortable. The account was mine. The investment was mine. The future it represented was mine. 11 years ago I had believed that combining everything was the right expression of commitment. That merging finances meant merging lives in the most honest way. That transparency meant sharing every account, every decision, every default. What I had not understood then, what I understood now with absolute clarity, was that transparency only works when it goes both ways. He had stopped being transparent years before he moved the savings. He had just done it quietly enough that I had almost missed it. Almost. The wedding was for a college friend named Priya. Beautiful venue. String lights over an outdoor courtyard. The kind of evening that made even difficult seasons feel momentarily gentle. I had considered not going. Mark and I had both been invited. We had known Priya through overlapping circles, and I knew there was a chance he would be there. I went anyway. I wore a green dress I had bought the week before, the first thing I had purchased purely for myself in months without thinking about whether someone else would approve of it. He arrived an hour after I did. I saw him come in across the courtyard. He was with a group of people I recognized, and for a moment he was animated, laughing, playing the part. Then he saw me. Not with the group. On my own. Standing with Priya's aunt near the flower arrangement, holding a glass of something sparkling, completely at ease. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Just a small adjustment. The performance paused for a second before restarting. He didn't come to speak to me. I didn't seek him out. But I felt his awareness of me for the rest of the evening. The glances from across the space. The recalibration happening behind his eyes each time he looked. He had expected, I think, to see someone unraveling. What he saw instead was someone who had already rebuilt. That was worth the green dress. The rumors reached him through a colleague of mine named Warren who knew Mark socially. I had not engineered this. It was simply the natural consequence of living a life that was becoming visibly different. People talk. People notice when someone who was half of a couple suddenly seems whole on their own. Warren apparently mentioned to Mark, in passing, at some kind of work event, that I seemed to be doing well. Thriving was the word Warren apparently used. New apartment, strong at work, recently had a piece of work recognized internally. Angela told me later that Mark had gone quiet after that. Asked a few questions. Warren hadn't known much more than the surface of it, so there wasn't much to share. But the effect was clear. Mark had built his narrative of this separation, the story he was telling himself and probably others, around a version of me that was struggling. Coping. Reactive. He was the one who had made the decisive move, the bold choice, the protective act. And now that narrative was fraying. Because the person in the story wasn't behaving the way the story required. I was not struggling. I was not reactive. I was, by all available accounts, fine. Better than fine. And that was more unsettling to him than anything legal I could have done. Conrad and I met for the final review on a Wednesday morning. Everything was in order. Every account documented. Every transfer traceable. Every individually sourced asset clearly separated and protected. The investment fund was growing. My credit profile was clean and strong. The legal documentation my attorney, a focused woman named Patricia Rowe, had prepared was complete and airtight. "You're in an exceptionally strong position," Conrad said. "I know," I said. Not arrogantly. Just honestly. "Most people come in reactive," he said. "They've already lost ground before they start trying to protect themselves. You came in before the damage could happen." "I came in before he knew I was coming," I said. Conrad smiled slightly. "That too." I looked at the documents spread across his desk. 2 months of careful, patient, invisible work. The financial architecture of an independent life, built quietly and precisely while Mark assumed he was the one setting the terms. He had moved money to protect himself from me. What he had never considered, because it required seeing me as a full person with my own capability and foresight, was that I might be doing the same thing at the same time. Better, in fact. With documentation. "Send everything to Patricia," I said. "I think it's time." The night before everything changed, I sat on my balcony for a long time. The city was doing what it always does at that hour, settling into its evening rhythms, lights coming on in apartment windows, the distant sound of traffic softening. I had a cup of tea. My notebook. The small framed print of the coastline visible through the glass door behind me. I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago. Taping boxes in a half-empty living room, hearing 2 casual words, for safety, and feeling the cold clarity of finally understanding what she had been living inside. She had been afraid, that woman. Angry. But also, and this was the part one had to be honest about, she had been ready. Not prepared, exactly. But ready. As if some part of her had been waiting for the moment that would finally make the choice unavoidable. I was grateful for that readiness. For the years of discipline and record-keeping and careful attention that had made it possible to move quickly when moving quickly mattered. I was also grateful, in a quieter way, for Mark. Not for anything he had done well, but for the very completeness of his underestimation of me. If he had seen me clearly, I would not have had the space to do what I did. His arrogance had been my cover. I finished my tea. Put the notebook away. Tomorrow would be its own thing. I was ready for it. He came to my apartment on a Thursday evening. I had expected this. Patricia had served the legal documents 3 days earlier, and I knew once he reviewed them with his own lawyer the reality of his position would become clear. I had left the door to this conversation open, not to give ground, but because I had nothing to hide and no reason to avoid it. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked different from the last time I had seen him at Priya's wedding. The performance was gone. He was just a man in his late 30s standing in a hallway looking like someone who had just been told the map he had been following was wrong. "You can come in," I said. He came in. Looked around. The apartment was quiet, orderly, fully mine. He sat on the edge of the couch. I sat across from him. "How did you," he started. Stopped. Started again. "The accounts. The investments. All of it. When did you?" 3 weeks before you told me about the savings," I said. He stared at me. "I saw the transfers," I said. I knew what was coming. So I moved first. I kept my voice completely even. "You said you moved the money for safety." I understood that. I did the same thing. For my safety. A long silence. "I thought," he said. "I know what you thought," I said quietly. "You thought I wouldn't." He sat in my living room for almost an hour. There was no shouting. No accusations flying back and forth. That part of our marriage, the years when we had still fought loudly enough to believe the fighting meant something, was long past. What there was instead was a slow, almost quiet reckoning. He asked questions. I answered them honestly. I told him what I had done, when I had done it. Why? Not to wound him. Simply because the time for managing what he knew was over. He asked if I had planned this from the beginning, meaning the marriage, meaning all of it. "No," I said. "I planned this from the Tuesday I saw the transfers." He was quiet for a long time. "I thought I was protecting us," he said finally. "I know," I said. "You always thought you were the one doing the protecting." I paused. "The difference is I was actually doing it. Every day. For 11 years. You just couldn't see it because you weren't looking." He flinched. Not dramatically. But I saw it. That sentence was not said to hurt him. It was said because it was true, and because there was no version of this conversation that could end honestly without it. He left about 20 minutes later. I stood at the window and watched his car pull away from the street below. I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph. No grief. Just the particular stillness that comes when something that has been unresolved for a very long time is finally, completely, resolved. Spring came properly about 3 weeks after that evening. The kind of spring where it happens all at once. One day the trees are bare and the next they are fully, extravagantly green, as if they have been saving it all up and can finally let it go. I sat on my balcony on a Sunday morning with coffee and my notebook and the city spread out below me, fully alive in the way cities are when the cold finally breaks. My phone had notifications. A message from Angela asking about brunch. An update from Conrad about a quarterly review. An email from my manager about the promotion, which had come through the previous week. The project I had thrown myself into during those first sharp months had paid off in ways I hadn't even calculated. I read them all without rushing. Responded to each one in turn. Then I put the phone face down on the table and just Saturday. People who had known us as a couple sometimes asked me now, carefully, in the way people approach things they're not sure how to say, whether I was okay. Whether I was healing. Whether I needed time. I understood the question. I appreciated the care in it. But the honest answer was that I had been healing for much longer than they knew. The real healing had happened in those quiet months, the bank visits, the financial reviews, the evenings in the new apartment building something that was entirely mine. By the time everything became visible, I was already whole. Mark had moved money to protect himself from what he thought I might do. What he had never understood was that I wasn't going to do anything to him. I was simply going to become, finally and completely, myself. And that had turned out to be more than enough.